Africa has been dubbed the continent of the future, while China is stepping up its efforts to pursue a Chinese path of modernization. How can the two go hand in hand? How has China been conducting aid and development cooperation in Africa and Global South in general? Hussein Askary, a senior expert on China's economic partnership and aid to Africa, has been conducting research in the field for years, and he roots for China as a partner to build infrastructure in Africa and the Global South in general. Why? I was pleased to be joined from Stockholm by Hussein Askary himself, who is Southwest Asia Coordinator for the Schiller Institute and Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. "14 years ago, you recorded a video in front of the Merowe Dam in Sudan, which was Africa's largest modern hydropower project, and it was built by two Chinese companies in that country. And you called it an example of international cooperation in a globalized world. What motivated you to do that, and why do you say that?
Yeah, this is a very fascinating story because at that time in 2009, there was an international outcry that there was genocide going on in Sudan, in Darfur. There was a civil war, and the government was accused by the international court. So an organization in Sudan organized an international conference, and there were international delegations to discuss this question of, was there really genocide in Sudan? And it was a typical foreign intervention operation originating from Chad. But the civilian population were caught in the fighting. So that was the reason. But in the middle of the proceedings, I asked the organizers of the conference, because of my interest in economic development, that they take all the delegations to the site of the Merowe Dam, because I had read some things about it, which fascinated me. So they agreed, and all the delegations from the United States, from Europe, were taken in buses to the site of Merowe Dam, north of Khartoum, the capital. And there you have a completely different world. I mean, this was the most modern construction site in all of Africa. This was the biggest project engaging Chinese companies outside China. The contract was signed 2002. This was long before the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. And therefore, you had not only a major dam built, the largest in Africa until now, maybe the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia will surpass it soon, but that was the largest hydropower project. But the Chinese companies not only built the power, the dam itself and the power generation, which was 1,250 megawatts, but they built a completely modern town in the same area for the people displaced by the dam, the villagers. They built a state-of-the-art hospital with the only cancer diagnosis center inside that hospital in the whole region. They built an international airport. They built an irrigation system which enabled the farmers who were using techniques as old as the Nubian civilization 5,000 years ago. We saw some of it in some museum. Now the farmers in that area, the Sudanese farmers, could use modern machinery, modern irrigation system to harvest not only once, but 3 times a year, because Sudan is known as the breadbasket of Africa.
Yeah.
So the Chinese companies, and this project was financed also, the largest Chinese financing by the Export-Import Bank took the largest share of the financing of the project. So this was a very fascinating contrast between what being said about Africa, genocide, incredible crisis, the whole West was mobilized, and everybody forgot that this is the model of cooperation. The interesting thing is that it was not only Chinese companies, a German consulting engineering company, La Meyer, was involved, and the turbines for the power generation were provided by Alstom from France. So this was a fantastic model for international cooperation in that very spot. And
were your co-travelers from the West impressed? What were their reaction?
In the beginning, everybody, especially the Americans, we said, why are you taking us on this? We are not here for this purpose. I said, look, Africa's problems cannot be solved with military means. You cannot solve it by changing governments, because you cannot do that without economic development.
Yeah.
If you don't have economic development, you will not be able to impose these models from outside. And this has been the perennial problem with the West trying to engineer political change in Africa, which does not really fit, the square and the circle. So they start with, say, if we change the political structure, everything else will change. And that's false, because if you don't bring economic and social benefits to the
Then
population.
why don't the Western countries go and build these projects so that there can be economic foundation for any political change? Why are the Chinese primarily going there to Africa, building hospitals, building bridges? What are on the mindset of the Chinese, and what are on the mindset of their Western counterparts, according to your understanding, Askary?
Yeah, well, my understanding through many, many years of experience working with African nations and in West Asia, the Western model, first of all, it considers Africa as a source of raw materials. That has been since the colonial area. And also you had this notion that you have to teach Africans how to run their governance, because they're incapable of doing that. China's approach is different. China says we are a developing nations. I mean, one of the most inspiration sources for me to understand the Chinese policy is a speech given by President Xi Jinping at the China-Africa Forum Summit in Johannesburg 2015, where he said Africa is fully capable of industrialization, exactly as we did in China. But there are three bottlenecks you need to resolve. And that's the lack of capital, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of skilled labor. If you solve these three problems, you will be capable of reaching industrialization, eliminating poverty. Now look at the difference, because China did not say you have to have elections, you have to have democracy, you have to respect the human rights, you have to. China said, look, we have an experience as a developing nation. This is how we did it. You are fully capable of doing the same. And therefore, the two being developing nations coming from the same area, from post-colonial colonized nations and dominated nations, they can match their methods of development. While in the West, they are trying to impose a model which does not really fit Africa.
How are Chinese proposals and principles being viewed in Africa on the ground, or in West Asia, where you have been talking to and you have been investigating all of these projects? How have they been received, and how sustainable these projects are? Because, as you said, the dam, the initial construction investment, of course, very nice, very high, but to keep the system running on its own without China's assistance, without China, injecting cash or personnel, how sustainable are these projects?
Yeah, well, we have a contrast here. We have two different things happening at the same time in these countries. In Sudan, while we have this massive development, which I said this is a model, this is not the solution, but this is the model you can do in Sudan and Africa. But this has to be generalized, because you cannot have half of the country developing and half of the country being destabilized by political, military, and other means. And therefore, respecting African nations' right to develop, this is the first stage. This is the first step you have to take. But unfortunately, we have an international system until recently, which was dominated by this Western thinking. Now, gradually, and also the view of China has changed, and also of Russia in Africa and in West Asia has changed. And in the recent period, the total failure of military interventions, political interventions by the West, by NATO, by the United States into Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, has shown everyone that this is the wrong way to go. And therefore, the Chinese way of doing things with the Belt and Road Initiative now has finally brought fruit to this. The Iran-Saudi Arabia normalization process, which was brokered by China successfully, now is changing the whole dynamic. We have seen that in Yemen now, after 8 years of horrible war, we have a new dynamic for peace.
Right.
And therefore, nations are realizing that working with China, China does have a model for cooperation. The United States does not have that model for cooperation, and it does not benefit the people and their sustainable future aspirations.
Is that why you have actually proposed designed a reconstruction plan for Yemen to build development corridors, one stretching from north to south and one stretching from east to west, with the help of China. And that idea is adopted by the Yemeni Investment Authority. Tell us more about this idea. Are the Chinese on board, by the way, and why do you come up with this idea?
Yes, well, I have a motto in my work is that I'm very optimistic because that's how you survive in the middle of terrible wars. And my motto is that the future determines the present, which is a bit paradoxical. Because if you don't have a vision of the future, you cannot solve the problems of today. In 2018, when the only news coming out of Yemen is that a Yemeni child dies of hunger every 10 seconds, that was the news. But at the same time, I was thinking about how, if we're going to reach peace in Yemen, you have to give the people and the leaders in Yemen a vision of the future, how their future could look like if there is peace and a diplomatic solution, but based on economic development. So I proposed this to friends in Yemen, and we have very, very enthusiastic group there. One of my friends, Fuad al-Ghaffari, he created a whole group for the study of the BRICS nations, how their development is going on. And he's now the advisor to the prime minister on BRICS affairs in Yemen. And he was very enthusiastic, and we had a group of engineers, and then the Yemeni Authority for Investment said, look, let's do this study. So I looked at the idea of development corridors, which we have in the Schiller Institute, studied for many years. And then I took all the data from Yemen with the help of these institutions about agriculture, rain, how much it rains, the roads, and so on and so forth. And we designed development corridors which will not only unify the country, but it will industrialize and revolutionize its economy, because it's a very rich country, but its resources have been misused. It has a fantastic geographical location, and that's why the second part is connecting Yemen to the Belt and Road, both by land as a bridge between Asia and Africa, but also on the Maritime Silk Road. The reason I think China is interested, because China has a long-term cooperation with Yemen. I remember in the 60s, they built the first highway in Yemen. And actually, many engineers and workers from China died. My friends in Yemen just recently, the Chengming Day, they visited the Chinese cemetery to honor the Chinese engineers and workers who died while building that road. And China is very interested. Before the war broke out in 2015, China was developing the Aden port container terminal. So I have a good knowledge that China is and will be interested in this, because the way to achieve peace is through economic development.
Of course, and especially after countries devastated with war propelled by foreign forces, reconstruction is extremely important. Development becomes even more important. We have to leave it there, unfortunately. Hussein Askary joining us from Sweden. He is the Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, and also a South Asia coordinator for the Schiller Institute. Thank you very much for sharing with us your valuable insights. With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.